So far, we have seen how GDP is computed in an economy producing three goods. However, in the real world, with a country producing millions of goods and services, we need to understand how the GDP is computed by statisticians and economists. We therefore need to dive deeper into understanding the components of gross domestic product and the economic entities that are involved in contributing to the gross domestic product of a country. We quickly browse through some of the basic economic definitions or terms that you would be required to get comfortable with, as you will come across these terms quite frequently while studying how the gross domestic product is computed. We then explain how GDP is computed by starting with a simple two-entity economy, households and firms. We then build on this hypothetical model to a more complex, realistic model by including more entities such as the government and the rest of the world. Let's begin with the concept of flows versus stocks. Flows versus stocks. Flows can be thought of as the flow of water into a bucket, and the stock is the bucket of water. Flows are variables that measure a rate per time. For example, the number of hours worked per week. Stocks are values at a point in time. For example, total inventories in a firm or the total amount of money in the economy. Next, let's look at capital versus investments. Capital is a stock. So capital is a stock of building, plants, equipment, inventories, residential and non-residential buildings, and durable goods. Capital refers to existing stock. Investments are purchases of capital and hence addition to existing capital or incremental capital. Investments can be further categorized into inventory investments or fixed investments. Net investments are investments minus depreciation. So investments are flows versus capital, which are stock. Now there are three measures of aggregate economic activity. By aggregate economic activity, we mean the sum total of economic activity of a country as a whole. This basically means that we can measure gross domestic product, which is the sum total economic activity, in any of the three ways. By the sum of the expenditures, which is called the expenditures method, or the sum of incomes or total products produced in an economy. Whichever way you measure gross domestic product, it amounts to the same figure. The most popular method is the expenditures method that aggregates the sum of all expenditures by the various economic entities. By economic entities, we mean households, firms, government, and the rest of the world. Now let's understand what income is. Income is the total payment made by firms for the receipt of services. These services are provided by households, and these services are called factors of production. So households provide firms with labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship so that the firms can produce goods and services. So firms need labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship, and in turn they provide households with income. Income is therefore wages paid for labor, interest paid to creditors for capital, rent paid for land, and profits paid to shareholders. So income is another measure of aggregate economic activity, since it is the amount paid for the factors of production that have created the final goods and services. Households provide land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship to firms that need to produce goods and services. Now, expenditure is the purchase of final goods and services bought by households, firms, governments, and foreigners. The keyword here is final and not work in progress goods. We can measure expenditure by calculating the amount spent in a year in an economy as a whole. Consumer durable goods, new houses bought by households, buildings bought by firms, plant and equipment, inventory increases, goods and services bought by governments, imports, etc. So the expenditures is a second measure of economic activity, aggregate economic activity, or a second measure of gross domestic product. The final measure of economic activity is by product. So these are the three measures of economic activity: aggregate economic activity or gross domestic product. We now move on to understanding the importance of gross domestic product as an indicator of economic health. Let's quickly understand why we need to measure the gross domestic product as an indicator of economic health. When countries enjoy periods of high economic growth as measured by the gross domestic product, firms are producing goods and services more rapidly. This increase in production causes incomes to increase, and higher incomes implies higher consumption spending, which further increases the demand for goods and services, causing firms in turn to produce more. So we see in a high growth environment, jobs are plenty, financial markets are booming, and consumer confidence is high. On the flip side, in a slowing economy when the gross domestic product is low, firms cut back on production and later cut back on employment. Jobs become scarce, consumer spending slows down as consumer confidence is low, and therefore production of final goods and services reduces, further reducing incomes. This increase in unemployment rate is also politically sensitive and bad for financial markets. So this is why the gross domestic product indicator is considered as the mother of all economic indicators in the financial world. The GDP is therefore defined as a measure of living standards, a measure of goods and services that can be bought by the incomes of all the individuals in an economy.